We will now open a hearing on House Bill 2533. Staff.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. For the record, Kristen Frazier with committee staff. I'll be presenting House Bill 2533, which requires that the legislature enact appropriations for K-12 purposes before it may take action on other budget bills. Briefly, by way of background on the budget process, the legislature typically enacts three what are called omnibus appropriations acts. Those would be more colloquially known as the operating, transportation, and capital budgets. By way of background on the basic education obligation, as this committee is aware, the Seattle School District line of cases, reaffirmed most recently in the McCleary case, has declared that Article 9 imposes on the state a duty to define and fully fund a program of basic education. The Basic Education Act directs the legislature biennially to appropriate funding for basic education purposes. House Bill 2533 requires that appropriations for K-12 basic education and other K-12 purposes be in legislation that is separate from the Omnibus Operating Appropriations Bill. It requires that these appropriations for K-12 purposes be enacted into law before it's in order for the legislature to take executive action on other omnibus operating or transportation budget proposals. As for the fiscal impact, the effect of this bill is on the process rather than on expenditure, so there is no direct fiscal impact from the bill. It speaks to how the legislature enacts the laws.
Thank you very much. Representative Dameyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, I'm State Representative Bruce Dameyer. I have the privilege of representing the good people of the 25th Legislative District. Madam Chair, I appreciate the opportunity to testify before this bill today. I appreciate your sponsorship, that of the Vice Chair and the ranking member on this and the other assistant ranking member on this. I think this is an important piece of legislation. And I think it's important that I set a little bit of the context. We have some newer members on this committee, including our two newest members. So I think there is an important role in giving them a little insight into how we got here. First of all, we're all very well familiar with our constitutional responsibility. Our forefathers clearly saw that education was critical to a successful democracy and economic prosperity. They put that paramount duty language in our Constitution with very strong effect. It is the strongest language of any of the state constitutions. The other bit of background that is important to know is that in 2009, this body passed House Bill 2261, which not only had the sponsorship of myself and four other members of this committee, but laid out a plan. It acknowledged the challenges of where we are and laid out a plan going forward that would rectify that would get us to get our children to where they needed to be and get our state to funding what it deserves and needs to fund. Then as we came into this session, we had the landmark McCleary hearing. And many of you know that that was not the first landmark hearing on education issues, that back in 1977 we had Dorn 1 that essentially addressed the same issue, that we were not living up to our paramount duty to fund our schools. There's a few things that I think are fundamentally different in this McCleary hearing. First of all, we know that the Dorn decision on itself was not sufficient to change the legislature's behavior. We're back there again with a similar type of ruling. The second thing that we noted is that the ruling was particularly sharp in its criticism and particularly sharp in some of its language that it used. I would like to quote just briefly from page 47 in the ruling, where it says, "The state must amply provide for the education of all Washington children as the state's first and highest priority before any other state programs or operations." I think that's very significant. The third thing is that it requires continued court oversight. That's very significant for us in our separation of powers. And the fourth and final thing would be that we know today the education of our children is even more critical for their future success than it was back in 1977. So with that, the bill before you is exceedingly simple. It merely says we need to pull out the K-12 section of the budget, the funding of our schools, and pass it separately and before the rest of the omnibus budget, for the omnibus operating budget. That is what my intent behind this bill is, that it would shine the bright light of accountability on our paramount duty, on our responsibility, on our promises in House Bill 2261, that it would force us to vote on that. It's as simple as that. It's a very simple concept and a very simple bill, that it would directly give us an opportunity to directly say, are we living up to our paramount duty, and are we achieving those promises? I would like to address a couple of potential complaints, or a couple of opposition criticisms that could come up to this bill. The first is that it's a change in process. It doesn't provide any additional dollars. That is absolutely accurate. It does not guarantee we provide additional dollars, but it does guarantee that we hold ourselves accountable with a vote, specifically on education issues, specifically on our paramount duty, specifically on our responsibility to fund our schools. The second thing is, people say, well, isn't this a partisan political gimmick? And I would argue absolutely not. The members of this committee know that I've worked hard in my time down here to make the funding of our schools and our education issues a bipartisan issue. And I am proud of the bipartisan sponsorship of this bill, and I'm proud of the bipartisan work on House Bill 2261. So this has nothing to do with that whatsoever. In fact, Madam Chair, I think this is will work to depoliticize part of our budget, to depoliticize education. And if you'll pardon me, one of the things that I also think would be very beneficial, there's an old adage of how do you eat an elephant? And the answer is one bite at a time. I believe if we were to pull the schools portion out of the omnibus budget where it competes with all the other programs, that might help our process move the budget along in a more efficient, more effective, and more transparent manner. The final one is, people say, well, what about the other programs that affect kids? A hungry child cannot learn. I couldn't agree more. This bill does not say that our schools are our only priority. It says, as the court requires, that they are our first priority. We certainly have many other priorities. And I would agree that a hungry student can't learn. But we all know on this committee, I'm sure, that a quality education is the surest way to lift someone out of poverty, more effective than any other state program we have. And finally, in conclusion, Madam Chair, I would argue that the status quo is continuing to fail. Fund education first. This bill is not a silver bullet, but it does force us to face up to our responsibility to our paramount duty. Madam Chair, I believe all of our students deserve it. I believe our Constitution demands it. And I believe our economic prosperity is dependent upon it. Thank you. I'd be open to any questions.
And I'm going to just make a quick question. Our budget these last 2 years, is over $13 billion for public education. And that doesn't include all children, because it doesn't include children birth to 5. And we will struggle with what's basic, and we will struggle with what's ample. If we were going to make a decision about ample for every student, do you believe that this bill would get down to that classroom level, service level, education level for every child in this state? I guess in your heart of hearts, do you believe by doing it at this level first, without really identifying the amount of money that needs to go out to every single child in this state to make ample education, do you believe this bill is going to get us to that point?
Madam Chair, I appreciate the question very much. And as you and I both know, this debate is the important thing. And that's the key thing that I think this does. Those are very important issues that you bring up, early childhood and higher ed on both ends. Both ends of K-12 of our basic education requirement are really important issues. And I think those are important debates that we must have. And I believe that if we were to pass, and if the legislature were to enact this bill, that they will facilitate that debate, that they will get us to confront the challenges that we faced in a direct way. I can remember when, back when 2261 was passed, I can remember having a conversation with Representative Orwell in particular, and we were talking about that passing that bill alone was probably the easiest vote we would take. That downstream there would be much more difficult votes as we implement. This bill is intended to facilitate and force those difficult debates and those difficult votes.
We have a question from Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, my question is for staff, and I feel guilty because Kristen sounds like she's lost her voice. My question is since the Duran decision, has the definition of paramount duty through Duran,
A great band of the
that would be
80s,
Duran
Mr.
would be
Ranking
Duran
Member.
2. Has the definition as put forward by the courts in the various decisions and opinions that have come down, has the definition of paramount duty at any time changed?
The recent ruling from the state Supreme Court in McCleary confirmed the court's explanation of the paramount duty in the, to avoid mispronunciation, I refer to it as the school funding or Seattle School District case, in that ruling from 1978. So they've affirmed the interpretation of what paramount means in terms of first or foremost.
Okay, just a short follow-up. Yeah, okay. So it's been consistent since 1978 when it was first put forward?
Yeah, the interpretation of the constitutional term, correct?
Yes. Okay. And in the plain language of the term paramount duty, as superior to all other things, the assumption we make in that it is superior to all of, therefore it is separate and discrete. Is that a reasonable?
Well, that would, I guess, that's a question that's a little bit difficult for me to comment on, Representative Anderson. Representative Dammeier cited the quote from the court ruling about paramount, meaning that the K-12 basic plan needs to be appropriated in terms of a highest priority. I can't say that that means it needs to be first in time, but the court did use the term as a first priority.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have, I'm going to allow 2 more questions. They're going to be very, very brief because we have 13 people who want to testify on this bill. Representative Sequist.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, let me ask you if there is another way to get to this same point. I agree with the priorities, but what I worry about is that if we agreed exactly what the definition of basic education was and funded it fully on day one, we would have fenced ourselves out of a series of other trade-off decisions. Throughout the rest of the budget, we would day after day come up with, well, should I put another $1 million into early learning, or should it go here? Or should I put that money into some agency's program, or would I get more of an output over here? So suppose rather than this approach, we actually created a separate education budget and worked it up to the end of the whole budget building process.
So thank you, Representative Sequist. I appreciate the question. I think it is important that we recognize that the court did 2 things that are important. First is they clearly acknowledged that 2261 lays out a path, that we don't need to be there today, that indeed we can't get there today, but we need to make progress toward that promise, toward that thing that we believe is the right thing for the students and right thing for the state of Washington by 2018. The second thing the court did is also acknowledge that the definition of basic education is not static and cast in concrete. That the definition today is different in some degrees than the definition of 1977. That was what 2261 was all about. And indeed, it will evolve as we go forward, as we address technology and things like that.
Okay, even quicker, Representative Rakedahl.
Thank you. Representative Dammeier, you referenced 2 monstrous reform bills that you were a part of in prior years. And as you know, no budget goes forward without the implication of other policy bills that we make necessary to implement. Would your concept here require that we also act on the ambitions of policy bills that are potentially linked to the budgets as those two measures were, or say charter schools, or some funding ambition we have in a policy bill, would that also have to go first and consistent with the education budget?
So I'm primarily thinking of the funding to the degree that we are assuming there are important, efficiencies, just like in our current budget. I think if there are bills that would significantly affect the outcome of that budget, then I think they would need to be assumed and planned for in part of that budget. That's how I would respond to that. Thank you.
Representative Dahlquist.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And maybe this is a question better asked of staff, but just quickly, how many other states actually take the education budget out and figure it separately prior to any other part of the budget?
Representative Dahlquist, I haven't researched that, but I can look into it for you.
And I would just comment that many other states do not fully fund, are not required to fully fund education from the state level. Many states really have communities relying on local, ongoing tax revenue sources to pay for their schools. So it's hard to compare. Okay.
And just really quick, there is no question, the federal government has separate appropriations. Other states do separate appropriations. They do not do one omnibus budget. And we do have the strongest constitutional language in the nation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is again lightning round because we have to get done with this bill in about 25 minutes. 13 people to testify. We're going to call them up, and each person will have no more than 2 minutes. The light is green when you start, yellow when you've got to almost finish, and when it turns red, you've got to be done.
Thank you, and we'll begin with Chad Mengendez from Issaquah, Tony Moore from Federal Way, and Monica Rupert from Enumclaw.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I'm president of the Issaquah School Board, also representing WASDA Legislative Committee and Washington State PTA today. I did give staff a copy of our resolution that we passed in support of Fund Education First. I'll let you read through it, and I won't go through the details of that particular resolution. But probably the most relevant experience for me was when we brought this proposal to the Washington State PTA Ledge Assembly 2 years ago. And it was a bit of an educational process for everyone because, let's face it, this started as a very partisan bill. It had a reputation as a partisan bill. And it was a journey for us as we started to look back through the court decisions, through the original Duran, Duran 2, the Ehrlich decision, and now the Supreme Court decision that's been very consistent in its messaging that this is an opportunity for us to really honor the constitutional language that we have that's so unique. There was this fear from folks in PTA that we were going to fund education only, not fund education first, and I think we resolved that. The point here is that we're being open and transparent with the prioritization process. And with the constitutional language we have, with the judges' decisions that we have, it's clear that we need to obey the law, and that's our first and foremost priority. Quite frankly, there's a bit of a trust issue with the budgeting process and parents. They look at what happens behind closed doors, and they want to understand how many pet projects seem to get funding despite the fact that they don't align with constitutional priorities. And so I think that this bill is a great step forward to making that process more transparent and recognizing the unique status that education has in our state. So really the question we need to ask ourselves is, do we want to bet on new taxes for education of the students in our state? And the resounding answer at Washington State PTA was no. The courts have said no. Their future is too important. We need to be transparent with this process and honor the constitutional priorities.
Thank you very much.
Madam Chair, members of the board, thank you so much for hearing us. For the record, my name is Tony Moore. I'm the president of the Federal Way School District Board. And our board stands in support of this bill as well. There is no bill that's going to solve the whole problem. We realize that, but we believe that this is a great first step. I've lived in Federal Way for 22 years. My wife and I are both committed to education, and I've served on the board for about 3.5 years. I didn't realize that 3.5 years ago I was going to adopt 22,140 kids. So I come to you this morning with a passion for making sure that we send a clear sign to every one of those children that that education really is the priority. It is the next civil rights movement of our time, and that we are committed to it. And of course, this is just one step along that line to send a clear message to every board that there is going to be some form of stability in the funding mechanism. Most of our time has been spent agonizing over the budget and the trade-offs that are going to take place as it comes to funding the needs. The other half of our time is actually spent on reforming the process. And if you follow education in Federal Way, you know we've been very aggressive at looking at the data to say these are the changes that have to take place in order for our kids to compete not only nationally but internationally. If we could somehow squeeze the conversation about finances down to about a quarter of our time, we could get a lot more work done that would help our children. And so I'm here speaking in support of this bill as a first step to move our state in the right direction. Thank you.
Good morning, Chairwoman Haig and committee members. I am Monica Rupert. I am a PTA mom and a leader from Enumclaw. I am here this morning to speak in support of House Bill 2533. In PTA, we work in the schools to help with children. We develop close relationships with educators and see firsthand not only where children need support, but where schools need support. Year in and year out, we see funding issues play out on a very personal level. We see the boy who's not reading well at 3rd grade and the staff unable to give him the time he needs. We know the principal who scrimped on supplies so the librarian could buy books. The teachers who opted for bigger classes so the kids had a counselor. Fundamentally, we see a disconnection between what the schools are trying to provide and what the state is able to fund. Figuring out how to fix that has been the forefront of our state legislative agenda for 27 years. Sometimes we call it fully funding education, and at other times responsive education funding, but it is always in the top 5, often at number 1. Starting in 1993, we asked for a new definition for basic education. We thought if we defined it and priced it, the state would be better able to align funding. Years later, we are still asking. In 2005, things started looking up with the launch of the Washington Learns. Then came the Basic Education Funding Task Force and its blueprint for student success. Then in the legislation in 2009 to implement it, then more waiting. The problem facing our state is not just the poor economy, it is a failure of the system year in and year out, a failure to identify and meet the funding needs of students. In House Bill 2261, our state has a solid plan. Now we need this body to embrace it and set the funding in motion. We are asking you to rethink the way you approach budgeting and your paramount duty to not only amply fund education, but to provide a general and uniform system of public schools. Thank you for your work on behalf of the children of Washington. I ask for your support of this bill.
Thank you very much. Next panel will be.
Thank you. And the next panel will be Frank Ordway with the League of Education Voters, Randy Parr with the WEA, and Jen Estroff with the Children's Alliance. On deck, if you want to come down to the front row, are Ramona Hantendorf and Bill Williams and Sean Lewis.
Chairperson Haig and the committee, my name is Frank Ordway, and I'm the Director of Government Relations with the League of Education Voters. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. We agree wholeheartedly with much of what Representative Dan Meyer said in his opening remarks, and we suspect that we'll agree with a lot of what the people that testified today in support of this bill. But we do have to testify against this morning, and for 3 primary reasons. One, our organization works very hard to increase the connections between early learning, K-12, and higher education. And we need to make sure that the funding in this state that allows that to happen allows for those connections to be robust. And we believe that this bill will further separate the K-12 system from those and make those connections more difficult going forward. We also are concerned about, in a minor way, the lottery question. I speak on education funding a great deal, and I always get hit with, well, hey, we did the lottery. I thought we already funded education. And so we're worried about this being sort of put out there as by passing this, that we have solved the funding question, which brings me to my third point. We cannot provide a stable and secure funding source for our schools with our current tax structure. We have tapped out what is available out there, and so we are not funding it amply now. And so without a restructuring of that, we're not really sure how you get to that endpoint of a quality, stable, and secure funding source for our system. In the McCleary case, the ruling conferred, and I'm going to read verbatim here, on children in Washington state, a positive constitutional right to an amply funded education defined as the basic knowledge and skills needed to compete in today's economy and meaningfully participate in the state's democracy. That speaks to a fairly broad look at what the role of public education is in the state. And while we entirely agree with the intent and the spirit of the sponsors of this bill, because of those points, we have to testify in opposition.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Randy Parr, and I'm with the Washington Education Association, and we support this legislation. As we agree, it is the state's paramount duty to fund education. It interprets the Constitution correctly, and as Kristen was telling you, the court said the paramount duty means you must fund education before any other program or service. The legislature will need to follow the phased-in approach outlined in 2261 and 2776 to be in full compliance, and you'll need to show real movement towards that timeline. However, we really believe that you shouldn't need a law to make education your priority. The K-12 system actually serves as the biggest social service agency in the state, and our members are on the front lines regularly and daily dealing with those children who fall through the cracks in the state's safety net. So therefore, we continue to be very concerned about other state services, such as Apple Health, that provides dental and health care to children, the foster care programs that provide the resources so the kids' lives aren't so disrupted that it becomes exacerbated when they attend in the classroom, and, for example, public health programs that keep lead out of drinking water and help kids' minds grow. So we share many of the things that Representative Dammeier was saying in terms of a hungry child can't learn. So while we support this measure, we're equally supportive of the non-educational programs that help children be the best they can be in the classroom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I'm Jen Estroff with the Children's Alliance, and we want to start out by absolutely thanking all of the sponsors for bringing this legislation forward. We're very excited to be able to have this conversation. And we agree that education should be amply funded. It should be fully, robustly funded, and we owe that to each and every child living in Washington state. And the concerns we have and why we're right now in opposition to this legislation is that we really know that we need to look at each child as a whole. And that means that to have their brain develop, to be able to be healthy enough to learn. And as we've heard several times today, you know, one of the things that we say and are happy to hear more people say is a hungry child can't learn. A sick child can't learn. A child that hasn't had access to early learning is not going to be able to perform in the classroom, even if you have the best teacher in the world in front of them. So we really want to make sure that kids' basic needs are met so that they're ready to hit the ground running and really succeed and have those opportunities in education and throughout life. We do also want to point out our concern about the effect that this could have on the opportunity gap. If kids aren't getting the other programs that they need to really succeed and to give them that fair start, that level playing field, we really don't know if this will at least continue the opportunity gap or potentially even expand it. Finally, we just want to, I think, echo the statement of the League of Education Voters when we point out that our tax system right now is broken, and we're really looking forward to working with you to fix that, to raise stable revenue, and to make sure that every child has the opportunity for a really strong start and a really strong education.
Okay, I'm going to put you on the spot just a little bit, any one of you. Again, we make decisions at the state level, $13+ billion for education, K-12 education. But when we get down to the amount of money per student, anywhere between $6,000 and $10,000 for 1 million kids in the system, how do we decide what's ample? Do we make the decision at the state level, say $13 billion should mean ample? Or do we get down to the student level and say every kid should get 6,000, 7,000, 10,000? What's the amount of money that we should be allocating per student? To me, that's the place where we should start, and I'm just wondering if this is something that you have a conversation about when you were thinking about whether you were gonna support this bill or not. I'm just gonna, yeah, just one person respond, it doesn't matter.
Oh, sorry. Well, I can, Randy, go for it. Yes, sir.
All right,
I don't want
two
to
people
fight.
can respond.
I don't want to fight over it. Each child brings with them unique challenges to the classroom. So to say that you can drill down to the one per student level, you can, but you're going to end up needing a weighted formula that actually takes into account the many different challenges that child brings to the classroom, whether it is English as their second language, disabilities, and many other troubling aspects that are far more profound than those I've just mentioned. So it gets really hard to say that you could do it at that individual student level, and yet you kind of can. I mean, your prototypical school model has set you up on a path where you can provide a ample level of resources to a school building such that they should be able to enable every children in that building to have the opportunity they are guaranteed under the Constitution. So I kind of look at it more at the building level, and I think that you've set yourself on that path through the adoption of the prototypical school model. And what dollar number that rolls up to, well, you know we've done studies, you've done studies, we all know what the numbers pretty close to are, and it's billions more.
Billions.
Billions.
Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, two questions. First is just a clarification from Randy's earlier testimony. With concerns, it is the WEA's position that they are supportive of this legislation?
Yes.
Thank you. In terms of Levin Alliance, I understand the concern over tax structure and tax revenues. I mean, I think there's a broad and growing awareness on both sides of the aisle that something's going to have to change if we are going to align with some of our aspirations. But there are also the economic realities of the ability of the state to provide a tax revenue base. So, I mean, there's a sort of a chicken and the egg problem there. But my question to you is, by testifying that, more revenue or a tax structure that provides more revenue is a preferred option in dealing with education funding issues, how do you respond to the fact that as the paramount duty, superior to all other things, we have some level of revenue, $28, $32 billion, whichever number you want to use. Why wouldn't, if it's superior to all other things, providing the first dollar that the state accumulates from any and all tax resources that it currently has would be the appropriate approach versus the fact that we would have to use the last dollar and then supplement that with a tax addition? How do you respond to that?
Well, I think that we kind of see that happening in many ways already. We've got big parts of the budget for basic education that are indeed walled off. The legislature has made excellent decisions in protecting, even though it's not part of basic ed, some of our investments in early learning. So in practice, I think we have done, to a degree, what you're suggesting, that we have prioritized those programs. And I would be hard-pressed to identify, the healthcare program that I would like to shortchange in order to put a few more dollars into class size. And so that's kind of where we are right now. We don't have enough revenue on the table today to amply fund basic education.
And I think that the Children's Alliance position is that, again, I mean, we know that we have incredible teachers in our systems and we have really hardworking communities that are supporting their kids. But even if every single classroom only had 8 children in it, if those 8 children were sick and didn't have a home to sleep in and were hungry, the actual learning and the actual effectiveness of our investment in education would not really be leading to that much progress in our overall education and making that a paramount duty. So when it says ample and when it says all children, and the McCleary decision defines what that means is every child, Our position is just, we want to make sure that investments get made early. I think the answer to the earlier question from our point would be, as much as an individual child needs based on their circumstances to get them to the same starting point so they're ready to go.
Okay, thank you very much. Next panel.
Since we only have two, Dave Powell would be next also with Stand for Children. Dave, you can come on up. Thanks.
Good morning, Ramona Hattner with the Washington State PTA. My fellow members briefed you, I think, on how our whole process went. I would just like to speak to the testimony that you just had. Health and safety, those are key. We advocate for the health and safety and the well-being and education of all children. And we see this as a strategic way to achieve that. Essentially, we've been struggling with this for years. We haven't gotten it right for years. It's the same debate over and over and over again. And what we see is if you really want to be able to, we need to be able to articulate what the other services are. What do we need to do for early learning? And what do we need to do for higher ed? And what do we need to do? We care deeply about the health and the safety, again, of kids. What do we need to do? And we feel that by focusing on education separately, we can have those conversations because we do need to figure out what we're doing with our education separately. We do need to isolate that and commit to that. We've got a hugely ambitious plan, but we feel by doing that separately and distinct and by itself and having those conversations, then we can better, in our mind, understand what we need to do in the other areas. And we do support revenue. We support fair tax policies that bring in the amount of money that we need to meet the needs of kids. So that, to us, is not an issue. It's not an issue of either or. We want it all. We're trying to figure out a strategy to get there because the way we've been doing it, it just hasn't been working. And I would say, we're asking our educators so much with our reform. And we were asking a lot of them. We ask a lot of our communities in paying with their taxes. This is our ask to you guys to think about maybe reforming the way you do your budget, rethinking it. If not this way, what other way? But the way it's gone hasn't fixed the problem, hasn't fixed the education problem, and it hasn't fixed the health, safety, and well-being problem either. So thank you very much.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, for the record, my name is Sean Lewis, representing State Superintendent Randy Dorn. Superintendent Dorn strongly supports this legislation. House Bill 2533 is the next logical step in education finance reform. It took you courage to pass House Bill 2261 that set up a new education reform model for funding schools. It took you courage to pass 2776, which began funding that model. And it will take you courage to pass this bill as well to make the education budget what it says in the Constitution, paramount above all else and should be funded first. This bill is consistent with the McCleary decision. For that reason, Superintendent Dorn strongly supports this. He thanks the sponsors for bringing this to this committee and urges this committee to pass it and to move this quickly so that education gets its ample fair share. But again, what I'd like to say on behalf of the superintendent, this is the next step. The last step would be fully funding that education budget that is passed first. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good morning. For the record, I'm Dave Powell, the Policy Director with Stand for Children. We are supporting House Bill 2533. We find this idea intriguing. While we appreciate the concerns of how this bill would affect the state's ability to balance education with other priorities, such as early learning, higher education, healthcare, and other human services, and we also recognize how this challenge is heightened during this time of shrunken revenues. At the same time, we continue to not adequately fund education. As the Supreme Court recently reminded us, we need to fund education at a higher level, and we need to spend those funds on strategies that will have a positive impact on student achievement, which will mean accompanying policy changes. Whether this bill would result in increased smart investments in education is unclear, but that depends on how well the tool is used. But it would cast a spotlight on the conversation about how we are spending how much we are spending on education and where that funding is going. And for that reason, if for no other reason, it's worth moving this idea forward and continuing to weigh how this might help us accomplish the state's paramount duty. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The next panel is Dave Nelson, Mitch Denning, Marie Sullivan, and Dan Steele. If you'd like to pull up a chair, we can just do a four-person panel, and that will close out the testimony.
Please begin.
For the record, Doug Nelson representing public school employees. We want to go on the record supporting this legislation. It's very simple, 2261, 2776, transportation funding formula. I think there's a very ambitious effort the legislature has done. The Supreme Court recognized it. I think there's a reason why the Supreme Court retained jurisdiction. I'm glad you caught that. We have great respect for legislators having maybe 147 different priorities when it comes to spending money. It's probably not 147, it might be only 130. But quite frankly, it is very easy to get distracted. The Supreme Court said you shouldn't get distracted. This bill formulates that you won't get distracted. We urge your support. Thank you.
Thank you.
Morning, Chair Hayden, members of the committee. Mitch Denning, representing the Alliance of Educational Association, WASBO, WMOA, and School Nutrition Association. We do support this bill. We thank Representative Danmeyer for sponsoring the bill and others that have done that. And we were here to talking before you on 2261, 2776, and now the third significant bill, 2533. And we want to work with you, as we've done for the last about 6 years, in terms of how we make it the first and the highest priority for our state. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Marie Sullivan with the Washington State School Directors Association. I'm not sure I could say it any better than Sean Lewis did with Superintendent Dorn's comments. So let me just say we're fully in support of this bill. In light of the recent McCleary case, it's hard to argue with the concepts of this bill. We know this is difficult. We know you face enormous challenges this year. There's a projected $1 billion and potentially growing shortfall. We get that. But this is the time to take the step forward and fund education first. Thank you.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, Dan Steele with school administrators. We think that it's very clear, has been clear for a long time, that education is paramount duty of the state. In fact, it's been clear since our Constitution was adopted. It's been subject to debate for a long time, though, exactly what that means. The McCleary decision, though, Supreme Court very much clarified that it is, in fact, education is the first and highest priority, and this bill would simply put that directive into practice. We think that's appropriate. I want to address some of the concerns about the other areas of government, though. The first response, and I don't mean to be flippant or callous, but quite simply, the other areas of government don't have the same kind of legal protections or constitutional requirements that K-12 education has. The second response, though, I think is more important, and that's the K-12 education, we don't believe, like the other areas of government, it's not just simply an expenditure. It is, in fact, an investment in the future. It's been proven that when citizens are educated, they're less apt to commit crime, they're less apt to need social services, they're more apt to be healthy, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to reduce the expenditures if you invest in K-12 education. Linked with that is the clear return on investment. For every dollar you give to K-12 education, the state gets more than that back. I want to also address, there's been a question about this bill this year and in years past. Is this just simply a message bill? Well, maybe it is, but I will have to tell you that it's a message that's appropriate. We think it's the right message, a message that needs to be sent, and we think that the adoption of this bill would send a clear signal to the Supreme Court and also the public that the legislature is in fact serious about its duty and constitutional obligation to fully fund basic education. We think it's time to pass this bill, and we strongly support it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That will close hearing on House Bill 2533.